In the winter of 1846, Ireland faced a crisis that would reshape its population and economy for generations. A fungus-like organism called Phytophthora infestans had arrived on the island. Carried across the Atlantic on ships from North America, it attacked potato crops with devastating efficiency, turning healthy plants into rotting, inedible mush within days. For a nation where nearly half the population depended almost entirely on potatoes for survival, this biological event exposed a system built on dangerous assumptions. Ireland in the 1840s was part of the United Kingdom, governed from London and integrated into British economic policy. The island's population had grown rapidly over the previous century, reaching more than 8 million people. This growth occurred alongside a transformation in how land was used and who controlled it. Most Irish families did not own the land. They farmed. Instead, they rented small plots from landlords, many of whom lived in England and managed their estates through intermediaries. The rental system created intense pressure. Plots were subdivided repeatedly as families grew, leaving many households with barely enough land to sustain themselves. Cash crops like wheat and oats were grown for export to pay rent, while families relied on potatoes grown on marginal soil. For their own food, potatoes had become central to Irish life because they produced more calories per acre than grain and could grow in poor conditions. A single variety, the lumper, dominated cultivation, was hardy and prolific, but genetically uniform across the island. When the blight arrived, this uniformity became catastrophic. The disease spread without resistance, wiping out harvests across entire regions. In 1845, roughly 40% of the potato crop failed. The following year was worse. In 1846 and 1847, the blight destroyed nearly the entire harvest. Families who had planted their plots in spring watched their only source of food disintegrate in the fields. The British government's response reflected the economic philosophy of the time. Officials in London believed deeply in free market principles and minimal state intervention. They viewed large-scale relief efforts as harmful, fearing that government aid would create dependency and distort natural market forces. When the first failures occurred, Prime Minister Robert Peel authorized limited imports of American corn and established public works programs to provide employment. These measures offered some relief. They were temporary and quickly discontinued. In 1846, a new government took office under Lord John Russell. His administration reduced intervention further. Relief programs were scaled back. Officials argued that Ireland should support itself and that further aid would discourage private enterprise. The export of food from Ireland continued throughout the crisis. Ships loaded with grain, livestock, and dairy products left Irish ports for Britain, while people in the countryside starved. This was not deliberately cruel policy, but rather the result of a system that prioritized property rights and market mechanics over immediate human need. Local efforts tried to fill the gap. Workhouses, institutions designed to provide minimal shelter and food to the destitute, became overwhelmed. Soup kitchens were established, feeding millions at their peak, but funding was inconsistent. The poor law system, which placed the burden of relief on local property taxes, collapsed under the scale of the disaster. Landlords, facing falling rental income and rising tax demands, began evicting tenants who could not pay. Evictions displaced hundreds of thousands of people, leaving them without shelter or land. Disease followed hunger. Malnutrition weakened immune systems and crowded. Unsanitary conditions in workhouses and temporary shelters allowed typhus, dysentery, and cholera to spread rapidly. Fever killed as many people as starvation. Medical services were inadequate, and isolation facilities quickly filled beyond capacity. Entire communities were devastated. In some western counties, mortality rates exceeded 20% of the population. The crisis revealed how fragile the system had become. Decades of policy had prioritized agricultural exports and landlord profits, while millions lived at subsistence level with no margin for failure. When the potato blight struck, there was no buffer, no stored food, no alternative livelihood for millions of families. The machinery of government and economy could not adapt quickly enough to prevent catastrophe. People responded the only way they could. Emigration became a mass movement. Between 1845 and 1855, more than 2 million people left Ireland, most bound for North America. They traveled in overcrowded ships with minimal provisions. Disease spread rapidly in these conditions, and many died during the crossing. Those who survived faced uncertain futures in unfamiliar cities, often arriving penniless and weakened by months of hardship. The demographic impact reshaped Ireland permanently. The population, which had been over 8 million before the famine, fell to approximately 6 million by 1851. It continued to decline for decades. Afterward, as emigration persisted and birth rates remained low, entire villages were abandoned. The Irish language, spoken primarily in the hardest-hit western regions, suffered a dramatic decline from which it never fully recovered. Economic effects lasted generations. The agricultural system changed as small tenant farms gave way to larger grazing operations. The trauma of the famine influenced Irish politics and British-Irish relations for more than a century. Questions about why intervention was so limited, why exports continued, and why the crisis was allowed to deepen became central to Irish historical memory and nationalist movements. Historians suggest the disaster was not inevitable. The blight itself was a natural event beyond anyone's control. But the scale of death and displacement resulted from choices made over decades and during the crisis itself. It's a system designed around export agriculture and absentee landlordism, left millions vulnerable. When disaster struck, the response was constrained by ideology that valued market principles over emergency relief. Warnings about the fragility of potato dependence had been raised before, but no structural changes were made. Records indicate that officials recognized the severity of the crisis, even as they limited intervention. Correspondence from the period shows awareness of mass starvation and disease. Yet policy remained largely unchanged. Guided by beliefs about how economies should function and fears about the cost and precedent of large-scale aid, the assumption that markets would naturally correct the situation proved catastrophic when those markets continued to export food while the population starved. The Irish famine stands as one of the 19th century's greatest humanitarian disasters. Between 1 and 1.5 million people died, and another 2 million emigrated. The social fabric of entire regions was torn apart. What began as a crop failure became a systemic collapse because the structures meant to support the population could not or would not adapt in time. The consequences of those decisions, made in meeting rooms in London and enforced across Ireland, echoed through generations, shaping a nation's trajectory in ways the policymakers of the 1840s never fully anticipated.